In May 2021, the remains of 215 Indigenous children were found in a mass grave in Canada. Some of the children were believed to be as young as 3. All the children are believed to have been students of Canada's largest residential school. Since then, more unmarked graves have been found. The current tally is 1,100. To date, no one knows how many children have died at residential schools or under what circumstances. But what are residential schools anyway, and why were kids dying in the first place? It all goes back to the colonization of Canada. Canada was inhabited by Iroquois and other Indigenous people, but that all changed in the 15th century when European colonists were looking for fur. By 1604, France established its first permanent settlement, New France. This was followed by Britain establishing settlements in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Hudson Bay. But the colonists also brought diseases and conflict with them. Many Indigenous people died from disease, and the fur trade caused conflict between Indigenous tribes and settlers. After the 7-Year War, which started in 1756 between France and Britain, France handed over its settlements to the British. In 1867, the British Parliament passed the British North America Act, which created one country called Canada. So, what do residential schools have to do with colonization? Residential schools were established in the 19th century by settlers. They were government-sponsored religious boarding schools for Indigenous children, and their purpose was to civilize and assimilate Indigenous children into European culture. The first residential school was opened in 1831, and they existed for well over 100 years, with the last one closing in 1996. Over these years, 130 residential schools, which stretched across the country, were run by Catholic, Anglican, and Methodist missionaries and were attended by around 150,000 children. The schooling system the kids were subjected to was brutal. Indigenous children were ripped from their homes and parents and placed in residential schools. Many were separated from their siblings, as the schools were often segregated by gender. When they first arrived at the schools, they were forced to cut their hair, were stripped of traditional clothes, and often given new names. The kids were forced to convert. Indigenous spiritual practices and culture was scorned. Up until the 1950s, residential schools worked on a half-day system. Children were taught for half the day and forced to work for the other half, so that the schools could run inexpensively. Girls were responsible for cooking, cleaning, laundry, and sewing, while boys were involved in everything from general maintenance to carpentry, construction, and agricultural labor. School life was highly regimented. The level of education was poor. The curriculum was designed at elementary level because the missionaries believed the Indigenous people were intellectually inferior. Many of the teachers were untrained. Up until the 1950s, holidays were periods of work and play at school. Many of the children did not see their families for years. The attempted assimilation left many Indigenous children disorientated, as they didn't fit into settler or Indigenous society. Abuse was commonplace, and many instances of violent beatings, chainings, and confinement have been recorded. Widespread sexual abuse also took place. Students were underfed and malnourished, and food was low in quality to keep the cost of the schools down. Some children in residential schools were subjected to nutritional experiments where they were deprived of essential nutrients and dental care. Their living quarters, sanitation, and clothing were often inadequate. A 2015 report says that at least 3,200 children died at these schools, but the number may be more than 6,000. Nutritional deficiencies and overcrowding led to diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, smallpox, pneumonia, and whooping cough. Indigenous children and parents tried to protest against the harsh conditions, and by the 1940s, residential schools were widely viewed as having failed. By 1969, residential schools were taken away from the control of the church and taken over by the Department of Indian Affairs. Over the next 20 years, most schools were closed. In the late 1990s, Indigenous communities began assisting people who were suffering long-term effects from residential schools. Survivors demanded that the government acknowledge their roles in the schools and provide compensation. In 2005, the federal government established a $1.9 billion fund for survivors of abuse at residential schools. In 2008, Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued an apology to survivors. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was run between 2008 and 2015. The final report published 94 calls to action, one of which was to introduce a federal day of commemoration. In 2019, the current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau acknowledged that the harm inflicted on Indigenous people amounted to genocide. In 2021, after the remains were discovered, the Catholic Church of Canada apologized to Indigenous people. On September 30th, 2021, Canada commemorated its first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation to reflect on the legacy of residential schools.